Okay, welcome to Structures 1 or ARC1046. I'm Shannon Hilchey. I'm going to be your professor for this term and hopefully continuing on next year when you do Structures 2. The Structures curriculum has been reworked in the past year or so. It used to be kind of one continuous course. It was broken up into two courses, but it started in September and finished in April. So it was kind of one long continuous course with a break in the middle. We're going to be doing Structures 1 this year, and then you have to wait a whole year to do Structures 2. So we'll have a good review next year. And I've had to kind of figure out a way to break this course into a clean cutting point. So we'll go through kind of what we do in this half and what we do in the second half of the Structures curriculum, because it's really all one big concept. So we had to find a way to break it down. You are here in my home. This week, obviously being week 1 and being still in more or less of a lockdown, my small children are home. I have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. All they've ever really known in their life is COVID. They were 1 and 3 when all of this started. Last year we did homeschool with I guess he was 4 last year. If he was going to be starting, he started JK last year. And we knew there would be lots of lockdowns and closings of the school. And we couldn't afford to have our routine disrupted too much. So we decided to just keep them home. And we had a nanny come in 3 days a week to kind of help us out so that we could still work. This year, we kept them in school and daycare. What that means is that anytime there is a lockdown, we will be on full duty looking after our children. That means that, unfortunately, a lot of that duty falls to me. I have an amazing partner. Dave, say hi. He's also an engineer. He owns a structural engineering company in Toronto called Blackwell Engineering. And so he's kind of the head of a 60-person firm. So between us, we're very, very busy. I will end up doing a lot of the online school with the children, though, when they're home. We've spent most of this week in quarantine. We haven't had COVID yet, or at least not that we know of, but the children were exposed last week at daycare. We've kind of made it through. We've done lots of rapids and seem to be good. It also means you're going to be hearing all of the noises of life. We do have someone here today helping out with the kids so that I can record my lectures this week. Hopefully they're going to be back next week. What I am trying to say is that I hope you'll be understanding when I'm an absolute wreck and trying to manage all of this. The partner to that is that I will also try to be very understanding of you guys. I cannot imagine doing your university curriculum kind of stuck in one place all the time, losing all of that personal interaction. I'm heartbroken for you guys. I also know kind of mentally this is hard, physically this is hard. My policy is, as long as you're trying and as long as you're doing all the things, if you reach out to me, I try to be very understanding about things. So we're going to go through some of this in a minute. So who am I? Why would I possibly be qualified to teach you this course? So I was an associate at Blackwell, the firm my husband owns. And when we moved in together, I figured it was probably a good idea to stop working there. So I had been an associate there. I joined the Cast Connects team just to try out something fun and different. My job was technically technical sales, but I got to do all kinds of cool stuff, travel all over North America, working with some of the top engineering and architecture firms around. So I was pretty lucky with that. And then I realized in 2014, I really, really missed doing the engineering, like the design and the engineering. So I told my pals at Cast Connects I was going to start up my own thing. I'm still pals with them, so I still kind of get to work with them now and again. And at the same time, well, I started my firm in March, and by that September, U of T reached out and asked if I'd consider teaching the structures curriculum. Um, so it kind of worked out perfectly that I had my own firm. I don't have any employees, mostly because, if he's got 60 employees, I figure that's enough for us to handle between the two of us. So here's some of my work. I haven't really updated this much. I just added one slide before I recorded this lecture. So some of these are pretty old. So this was a project I did very early in my career while I was at Blackwell. So this was, it's kind of one of the first projects I took a big lead on. Although Corey Zarell, who's also a prof at Waterloo, worked on this with me. So this is the Canadian Peace Bridge Customs Plaza. I normally tell students that if you've driven across the border and had your car torn apart, this is probably where you parked while you did it. Although most of you haven't crossed a border in forever, so many of you may not have even seen this. This is a really cool project in Toronto. If we ever have the opportunity to do Doors Open in person again, when you do Doors Open Toronto, often the NCFS Headquarters is part of it, and it is a gorgeous, gorgeous kind of renovation of an existing concrete building. The kind of infamous part of it is this beautiful longhouse that we did with Levitt Goodman. And Levitt Goodman really gave us the leeway to kind of run with this. They said, give us a structural interpretation, modern structural interpretation of kind of the basic longhouse. And so we really looked at kind of some of the indigenous forms, and we tried to represent that on the interior of the structure. So it's a reciprocal frame, meaning it's not stable until all the parts of it are in. And actually, Dave and I have given lots of lectures on reciprocal frames. We've talked in Helsinki, we've done podcasts in Australia. We've given lots of talks on reciprocal frames. So it's a really cool kind of micro element within structural engineering. It also had this cool element where all the floors had a big opening cut in the concrete. So obviously there was some kind of analyzing of the old existing building in that. But one of the really cool things was on the roof, they wanted to add mounds of soil up there. That roof was designed for some snow loads, and that was about it. It wasn't strong enough to take the loads that we needed. So what I did was installed a series of not very stiff but strong steel beams and applied hydraulic jacks in between them and separated or jacked between the two. So it pushed the concrete up and the steel down. Now what that meant is as you would load the concrete, it would unload the load pushing upwards. So now we're pushing up on the concrete. You put load on it, you push down on the concrete, and now the steel will take all the load. So there's this weird, you're hearing me say words like strength and stiffness. And so these are not the same thing. They can often be related. And that's why this lecture, in a little bit, we're going to jump into talking about kind of the three main concepts of structure: strength, stiffness, and stability. They're kind of loose concepts that we will spend the rest of the term doing math to analyze those things. We're just going to talk about them very loosely for this lecture. So my company, Fat Lab, focuses on doing high-end installations. So that could be canopies, feature stairs, guardrails, all of the precious little things that architects put their heart and soul into. So basically, I get to work with architects when they're at their happiest. This was a project this canopy was a component I did while I was at Blackwell still, kind of just wrapping up there. So this is an amazing, amazing structure by Shim Sutcliffe. I wasn't the lead engineer on the rest of the building. I kind of just took this canopy component. So you can see, you know intuitively that this doesn't look like most structures you see. You know it's weird to have something this big sitting on something so little. The term for this is a cantilever. We're going to talk about cantilevers further in this term as well. So you understand that it's weird that it's just coming back to a very short backspan. So backspan, cantilever. So these are all terms we're going to talk about throughout the term. If any of you do any work in the landscape department, you know North Design Studio. This was a cute little installation I did with them in the late 2000s, so 2008, 2009, I would say. This was on the Mall B, I believe, in Cleveland. So this is the facade for the York University Engineering Building, Lassonde Engineering Building. The base building was designed by ARC, but there was some kind of difficulty in wrapping the facade of this building, and I keep meaning to include a picture of it finalized. You should take the opportunity to Google it, look up a picture of that building now. It's supposed to look like clouds in the sky. They hired a mathematician to help them patternize their different panel systems that they were going to use on this, and some of them included glass. The problem is the windows needed to be very far out from the edge of their concrete building. The rest of it was very easy to support. The problem was, normally on a building, we build a concrete building, the people who do the walls or the stud walls come in and measure everything, go back to their plant, build it all, come back and install it, and then the window guys come in, measure everything, go back to their plant, build it, and come in and install it. So it's a sequential thing. They had a very short timeline, and they wanted the concrete to being poured while they were fabricating the wall system, while they were fabricating the windows. So this was a very complicated 3D geometric problem where there was 8 different radii on the curvature of this building. None of the panels were flush. They were all faceted, and they went around the building. And so we needed a way to support the glass windows. So I came up with a method to A, design it, but B, create file systems that could be provided to both the steel shop and the window fabricators so that they could build directly from my drawings. And if any of you have had the opportunity to work out at Varsity Center for High Performance Sports, I was the structural engineer on that. I did all the above grade steel analysis. So this is an absolutely stunner of a building, doing really, really cool stuff. I've been lucky enough to give some tours on the building, so if you ever see any of those come up through Toronto Society of Architects, you should definitely take the opportunity to go on one. So this was McLennan Yoncon Miller Architects, or MJMA, partnered with Pat Cow Architects. And this is the slide I just threw in this morning because as a one-person show, basically my fee ends up being the same fee for photos, but the architect herself went to site and took these photos, so she let me use them free of charge, and she has a really good eye. So this is the Tommy Thompson Pavilion Park with DTAH. For those of you that are in the city, you've probably gone to kind of clear your head for a long walk at the Leslie Spit. And if you've done that, you've probably walked by this new building with really kind of beautiful long cantilevers on this. Again, you intuitively know that this is something unique. You might not be able to put your finger on it or be able to articulate why, but you know that that length of roof with no supports is unique. So let's talk about this course just a little bit. It's broken down into 3 components for marks. We have the assignment, we have the project, and we have the exam. So the assignments, there are 10 weekly assignments. They are going to vary in difficulty. You're going to find this week's is not that hard if you just take a breath and do the work. You can open it on day 1 and it is available for you until you choose to submit it. If you don't submit it, it'll auto submit at midnight on the next Wednesday. So it's available on Thursday mornings and it'll auto submit at midnight on Wednesdays. But you can feel free to submit it anytime in there. There's no time limit. You can research whatever you want. I encourage people to talk to each other about the assignment. Try not to just say, give me all the answers, because some of them do change the numbers in it. It's a really easy feature to embed, so I haven't gone out of my way to make your life difficult, but it does prompt at least conversation amongst you. So feel free to talk about it. Your tutorials, I believe, are on Wednesday, so if you're really stuck, feel free to talk to other people and talk to your TAs, and then it'll be due that night. Usually the day after, or within a day or two after it's been submitted, I will post the answer sheet online so that you have an opportunity to see where you went wrong. You can submit the questions to the TAs if they have, but they'll answer your questions if they can. But they'll also submit kind of really good questions to me so that we can kind of email them out to everyone, so that, we don't have 20 people asking the same question. If it's a really good question, we should make everyone aware of what that answer is. All of the assignments have equal weight. They're going to look in Quercus like they have different values assigned to them. I download that and automatically convert them into 3% of your mark each. So each assignment is worth 3%. Those can add up if you skip your assignment. So try. Take a little while, even if you're running out of steam, take a little while and look at them. Try to arrange ahead of the due date if something comes up. Anyone who needs to make use of student services, please do it. Please register. It gives me a lot more leeway in making accommodations for you. I am very, very, very nice in allowing accommodations for people, but sometimes administration checks in. So it is very helpful if, obviously, if you're sick, let me know. If something came up, let me know. I've had people have appendix burst. One year I had 2 people have it in the same week. I know, it sounds crazy, but it was true. I've had people moving. Obviously, COVID has taken everybody for a loop. As long as you are kind of polite and nice and work with me on it, I'll do whatever I can to help you out. We'll come to the TAs in a minute then. Okay, the project. The project is due the very last day of the semester, but you can submit it earlier. In fact, I usually encourage people to try to submit it earlier. It kind of gets it off your plate. But I've been asked by the director over the past several years to just make it the last thing that is possibly due. I'll follow up with a handout, but the project actually has 2 parts, project part 1 and project part 2. All of it is due at the end. Part 1 is you're going to pick a simple static object. And the term static is very, 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 very important here. And we'll talk all about what static means coming up in the term 2, but essentially it means not moving. Something that if you let go of it, it stands there and it does its thing. If you put a load on it, it should stay there and do its thing. Now these can be everyday objects, and we'll talk about this going further. You're going to draw a free body diagram. We're going to talk about what free body diagrams are. And you're going to have to explain the loads you think are acting on that object. These are not buildings. We're going to be spending this term talking about buildings and building loads. You are going to have to determine what the worst loads that happen on your object are. And then the second part of the project is I'm going to assign everyone a series of elements in a fake building I've created. You're going to have 2 beams, 2 columns, I believe, and a truss. And you're going to have to determine all of the internal loads on that element. So we want to know the worst case internal loads. There are a series of steps we'll have to do to get there. And really it all comes together at the end of the term. By the end of the term, you will be able to do all of that. The exam. Now, this is very, very important. I do not set the exam date or time. Don't ask me to try to move it. I have 0 control over the exam. That is very much set. And I don't even think it's completely in the hands of our administration. Some of it is actually set by the kind of grand oversight viewing element that is U of T, but they work in conjunction with our department. Not everyone's going to get the same questions as you're going to see in the assignment. There will be like small variations, but they're all broken into groups so that they're all the same difficulty. So there's a question pool of these 5 questions that are variations of a similar thing. There'll be multiple choice, fill in the blank, math, and matching. So all of the things that Quercus lets me do. I love the fact that the exams are on Quercus now. They might try to push to have me go back to in-person, but they can't make me. I don't want to. I really like Quercus. The Scantron sheets always made mistakes, and so I always had to hand validate all of the Scantron sheets. Quercus is actually pretty great. It gives me statistics and diagnostics, and it easily flags for me. So say I make a mistake. I know. How could I make a mistake? But say I make a mistake on one of the exam questions. It is very quickly obvious to me when I'm looking at the marks that one question only had like 1% of students get it right, meaning they guessed the wrong answer. I now know that when I download that into my Excel platform, I can just give everyone full marks for that question. So Quercus is very good for that. There's never any kind of hidden flaws within the exam. It quickly becomes apparent to me. It's open book. I'll provide you an appendix, a PDF appendix on Quercus prior to the exam. Basically, you're going to find there's a lot of downloads on this, and I don't want you to have to print them all out. What I'm going to do is go through some of the key ones, and some of them are like 60 pages long. For the exam, I'll pull the 2 or 3 pages within that are going to be critical for you within the exam. So basically, I'm trying to shorten how many pages you have to rifle through to be able to do the work I give you. The assignments will be very good kind of practice problems for the exam, and any worked out questions in class. I really, really like lists and equations. Those make it very easy to make multiple choice questions out of. So the classes. Classes are going to be a PowerPoint with a video. Obviously, if you're watching this, you've found it all. Some of the professors are like, you can't record this. You can watch it. I'm watching you to see if you make any recordings of this. I figure, what the hell? It's only in your advantage to be able to go back and watch this as many times. If you're taking the initiative to watch this 3 times so you can get the right answer, holy smokes, what a win for both of us. So I post my videos to YouTube. I don't take them down. If you're eager, you can go watch old years versions of it. I've been posting them on YouTube since COVID started. So there's past versions of this term available for you as well. If you're really eager, you can look at my my elective course just for fun. You know, Friday night, feel like doing something, pop some popcorn, watch some of my bonus lectures. The first slide, I always try to do, here's what we're going to talk about. And the last slide, I try to do a summary of, here were the key learning points. These are the things I expect you to take away from this lecture. I'm always going to, this says Wednesday, that's supposed to be Thursday. I always, last year it was a different day. So I will update this for you in the, I don't know what slide we're on. So you'll often see me do this during the lectures where I write myself notes, and then you might find that the PowerPoint doesn't quite match what was in the video. That's because I've gone back and fixed the things that I discovered while we were talking this through. The assignment answers will be available after the due date. The tutorial was set because this was originally supposed to be in person. Even before the latest lockdown, I said, listen, I have a 3-year-old and 5-year-old. I really don't like the idea of being in 2 classrooms on the same day with over 100 people and then coming home to my unvaccinated kids. Acknowledging that my littlest is in daycare and my oldest is going to school. Those are kind of really protected sites. We have had very little transmission here in my municipality. I just wasn't comfortable with it. So they granted me the freedom to do this online. I've had really good feedback about this course being online. A lot of people have preferred it simply because this is a lecture where it's 3 hours of me talking. There was very little benefit of the in-person component. And this way you get to go back and watch it as many times as you want, or you can pause it. If you wait 2 or 3 days, YouTube will often add subtitles. So for any of you where maybe English isn't your first language, or if you have a hearing impairment, Quercus is really great for that because it will add subtitles. I have no control over it. YouTube does it, not Quercus, YouTube does it on its own, but it takes a few days. So you might watch it the first time and it doesn't have subtitles, and then they will appear in a few days. On that note of any kind of difficulties along that line, I try to be very aware of things like dyslexia. I found the multiple choice format was really kind of confusing, so I tried to do it with colors and the words of the colors, acknowledging that some people might be colorblind. So that's why I also, instead of doing match A, B, C, and D with 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, which I find can really mess people up, I'll write match the things to each other, and I'll write option blue, but I'll write the word blue with the color blue. I'll write orange as the word orange in the color orange, and that's what you have to match up with a multiple choice sheet. I found it kind of cut out that difficulty, and I've had good feedback about that as well. Again, if there's something that I haven't thought of, if it is something that I can incorporate that makes life easier for people, I am happy to do it. I've spent a bunch of money on better video cameras and better microphones, and I've spent $6,000 on a better computer this year. So I will do what I can to make it better for you, but it can't be just complaining. It has to be something that I can actually do something about, but I will try if I can. The tutorial, what I was trying to say was set by the administration. They wanted that as a locked-in time slot. You can email the TAs. I've worked with them both before. They're pretty great. They're pretty diligent. They check out the assignment. They have a good idea of what's going on. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. So remember that there are a lot of you and only one of me. Plus I have another class. So if I could answer everybody's questions personally all the time, I would love to, because I find it really exciting and it really kind of helps prompt the conversation. But if I sent everyone an email, a personal email every week, I would just spend my entirety of my time sending emails. So start with the TAs. They will try to answer your question. And if between the two of you can't solve it, then come along to me and I'll do what I can. If you're emailing me though, let me know what course you're in. Because I won't know if you say, I don't understand assignment 3, question 2. I'll need to know what class you're in to be able to answer that. Like I said, a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old at home, hopefully they're going back to school next week and daycare. Forgetting the fact that they're going back, like my daycare had an exposure last week. One of the staff had COVID. And then this week, we were isolating anyway. We thought that was a smart thing to do, but they don't have enough staff. So they've begged people to keep their kids home. So they've really said essential workers only can bring their kids in right now. So even though school's going back, I might still end up with my 3-year-old or 5-year-old home, or both of them, periodically throughout the term. And I wouldn't be surprised if we have another shutdown this term. So what's my job? My job is to meet the requirements set out for the class in the lesson plan. Meet the needs of the majority of the class. Now, this is where I always sound like a little tiny bit of a jerk, and I apologize. Some of you are going to find this course a snooze fest because maybe you have some engineering background. Maybe you've already done one of these courses at Ryerson or Waterloo. If so, you have a unique opportunity to help your classmates. I can't wait to hear how you can help out. If you find that you struggle with some of the items in this, obviously reach out to the TAs, but the TAs are there to be a resource to the whole class. They're not tutors. So if you think that this is a course that's going to give you great difficulty, you might want to think about reaching out to a tutor. Now, I can say that there's always a lot of people that get very nervous about math in this course. I try to make it as simple as possible for you. I've usually only had 1 or 2 people each year that have really struggled. I can tell you that most of the people that have ever failed just didn't do the work. If you try hard, you can pass this course. You can probably even do pretty well in this course. If you commit to it, you can probably do all right in this. And then the last one is be reasonably available. If you email me, because if you've reached out to the TA and you guys couldn't solve it, I try to answer emails very, very quickly. Because of kind of the way life is right now, I usually look at emails at 4 a.m. 4 a.m. to 7 a.m. is like my email time. So if you don't want to hear the response from me early in the morning, maybe turn notifications off. But if you have emailed me, you'll probably get your responses at very weird times. The TA's job. They have to have a pretty good understanding of the concepts. They need to also be reasonably available. They're running the online tutorial sessions, and they need to be able to respond to emails within a few days. I hate it when people email me saying that they've emailed the TA but they haven't heard back. And then I see that they emailed the TA 2 hours before. Give them a little bit of time to get back to you. One of the things I really want you to understand, though, is that the TAs are not practicing structural engineers. They're students who have either done really well in my course, or maybe they've done an engineering degree, but rarely are they anyone who has practiced structural engineering, which is not the same thing. A lot of the concepts we're talking about would come from the real world experience. They will not have all the answers for you. They shouldn't have all the answers for you. But start with them. They can probably send you on the right path. If they don't have an answer, that's when you guys can come to me with the question. Again, they're not tutors, but if you require more one-on-one time, you should probably try to reach out to someone. So what's your job? You should watch all the videos. You should download the PowerPoints. You should review the examples. You should download all the material. Don't print all the material. You should download all the material. Maybe organize it nicely in a folder for yourself. You should submit any questions you have to the TA. You should definitely complete all the assignments. They're easy marks. Some of them you'll have to do some work. Like, it's not read it and you get all the points, but some of it, read it and you will get points. And then complete the project. I usually do a pretty good job of giving you a full description of what you need to provide me. I make it very easy for you to get marks in this course. Failing someone is a lot of paperwork for me. It's so much paperwork. I don't want to have to do it. So if you can pass, I think we'll both be happy. And then study for the exam. So if you need any extensions, additional time, or have special needs in any way, please contact Student Services so they can set you up in the system. I'll do what I can to help, but there are some things that I just am not allowed to do, especially when it comes to the exam. All right, you should take notes, but the slides are available. You can go back and watch the videos. You should just write down calculations, lists, and equations. I've always found it helpful to write something out. It helps lock it in my brain. I'm very nice about hints if you pay attention. Like, I will say, oh, this is a fantastic exam question because it's literally what is on the exam. So if you just listen to my tips and hints, you can probably, without even thinking, get a 30 on the exam. So I always get asked this question: why is there no textbook? I wish there was a textbook. I was in the process of helping write one with the CWC, or the Canadian Wood Council. That's being revamped a little bit into kind of a standardized lesson plan based on kind of the modules I wrote for them. But again, they're the Wood Council, so they're very focused on getting wood into structural systems. Not saying that they're biased, but of course they're going to be biased. They're the people who want to represent wood structures. Luckily, that's all the rage, so it works out pretty well. But we don't have a cohesive structural design for architects textbook in Canada. Now, why was I so specific about all of those things? Because they're all distinctly very important parts of it. So, we're talking about the structures curriculum. That's great. Structural engineers break these concepts into a whole bunch of different textbooks. So we start with our statics textbook, and then we jump into the structural analysis textbook. And then we also need to bring in the National Building Code of Canada, plus the commentaries, the Ontario Building Code, the wood, and then we have to start talking about the material side of it. So we need the wood design manual, the handbook for steel construction, and the concrete design handbook. I have, mostly with permission, so please don't tell on me, but most of them with permission, provided you with PDFs of the elements within these books that you need. The biggest problem with these two Hibbler ones is that they're American, meaning they often work in pounds and feet, or pound feet, inches, or inches, and they don't use the same equations we do. So there's a huge component of these that isn't even right for what we're doing. So rather than make you pay a lot of money for a textbook that we only need about 20 pages of, and even out of those 20 pages, some of them we would need to edit them with a red pen to make them applicable to our code, seems a bit ridiculous. Now, all of these things are available in the library. You can probably look up most of them online if you wanted to. And so I'm actually trying to save you a ton of money and a bunch of work that we really don't need. And coming to that, a lot of things, the kind of the field of structural engineering within the world I'm teaching you hasn't changed much in 150 years. So there's been very little new development in that time. If you forget about seismic design, if you forget about some material science components of it, most of it hasn't changed. The basic premise of it hasn't changed in 150 years. So with that in mind, the internet can be your friend. If you find that the way I described something was very confusing to you, and you've gone to the TA and they've described it slightly different, but you still don't like the way they talked about it, Google the thing that you don't understand. You might be able to find kind of something in print that works better for you. This is not me trying to offload. This is me trying to say that I understand not everybody's teaching method works for every individual. There is a really great set of videos that goes around the internet periodically, and somebody always sends it to me. But ARC Daily provided this article. So this was a person who was, now this is American, so it's not perfect, but they go through and basically do all the same stuff we do throughout this course. So why are you guys even doing an engineering course? You're architects. What do you care about the engineering component? You're going to hire your structural engineer. Well, you guys make a lot of choices very early in the project, often even before you have a structural engineer involved in the scope. So you are usually picking what material you want your building to be built out of. You need to have a sense of why you would make that choice. You've often usually done a preliminary layout of your building. So if you're doing a layout, you need to have a sense of what the preliminary sizes would look like on your building. So that means how deep would the elements in your building be? So you need to make material choices, a layout, and preliminary sizes. You should also understand just what you can't do with certain materials. Some things just are not going to be a good choice in certain applications, and you should have a sense of that. You need to understand what small changes can have a big impact. Some things are linear, you know. If you want to, if you're going to change the load on something, well, that's a linear problem. As you double the load, you need to double the strength of the system. But some things aren't linear. If you double the length of a beam, you are not doubling its depth. You are doing something very different. So a small change in length can have a big impact on your member size. You need to understand some of those relationships between depth, length, strength, and deflection, because these have a very complicated relationship. So these are difficult concepts with difficult math. I will always try to provide multiple versions of the same problem type. One we will do in the lecture, one you will often do in the assignment, and then sometimes I will even provide another worked out one. There usually, I'll do a worked out one in the assignment, and then there's usually a second worked out one that we don't go through together, but you have it there for a reference. So for most things, that's 3 different types of problems of the same kind of thing we're discussing. So I said that this is structures 1 and structures 2, and we need some way to break the information up into these 2 different courses. So different teachers break it up different ways. This is the way I came up with, and I've since seen a lot of other kind of course layouts that are very similar to this. So what we do in structures 1 is we talk about how we create our system. What's our preliminary design of the members? So this means not the actual design, but what would we put on a set of drawings very early on before we've done the design? So this would be what you guys do. This is the architect's job that we were talking about here. Then we'll talk about what the engineer does and how it works with you guys. We'll look at the loads and the load paths, and then we'll look at the element loads. So each element, what the internal load is on it. I'm gonna just pull out my handy, I have to hide this or else my kids play with it. So here is, I'll use this a lot to talk about how things, this has been squashed a little bit, hiding in my filing cabinet. So you can see that this is straight. If we put a load here in the middle, you know, it would be like it moving like this. So the question is, you can see the top of it squishing and the bottom stretching out a little bit. You can see those rectangles deformed in different ways. We want to know what's happening inside here that makes that happen. And so those would be our element loads, or the loads internal in our elements. And then in structures 2, we design and size the members. No problem. That's all we've got to do next term when we come back, when you guys come back and join me in 2023. It's really where all the concepts come together and allow you to pick the perfectly sized member. So that's where we have to talk about all of the different materials. And so how do these internal loads impact something in steel, something in wood, something in concrete? So basically this side we figure out what the loads are, and in this half we figure out what resists the loads. Okay, so now we're going to get into lecture 1. And lecture 1, we're just going to talk about what is structure. Really, why are we doing this? and talk about where it fits in the design process. We're going to do a quick review of basic math. I'm not going to spend any time showing you how to work them out. I'm going to assume that you've gone through some of that in your life, and if you need to, you can go back and look those up. But I just kind of want to give you a quick refresher on the basic math, and that will be on this week's assignment. And then we're going to talk about strength, stiffness, and stability, because those are really the three core concepts of structural engineering. And we're going to talk about what those mean. And the best way to talk about what those mean is to look at when they don't work. Because seeing when something works, it just looks like it's sitting there all the time. So we'll look at images of when something wasn't strong enough, when something wasn't stiff enough, and when something wasn't stable. And that'll really help us identify what we're trying to achieve. It's gonna seem like a bit of a blip for you. I'm gonna stop this and get a glass of water and then come back and keep recording. Okay, I'm back with water. Okay, so let's go through lecture 1. So, I just want to give kind of what does structural engineering mean? So, if you look up the definition for structural engineering, a field of engineering dealing with the analysis and design that supports or resists loads. Okay, so what does that even mean? Basically, we have to figure out all of the loads, all of the things that happen in the world on our building, and then we have to figure out how that moves through the building, and then we have to figure out if all of those things holding those loads up are strong enough to support all of those loads. So that's really what it's saying. The analysis is saying, is it strong enough? And the design is having an element that works. So what's our goal? Design safe, stable buildings that are the cheapest possible while meeting the constraints, needs, demands of the client. Cheap does not mean ugly, but it often means the lightest thing we can possibly do. So cheap is our goal. Is if you could pick 2 mugs that looked identical and performed in an identical way, why would you want the more expensive one? So we are saying, though, that it doesn't have to be ugly. That is one of the constraints. We are making something beautiful. Now, my job is within those constraints to make it as cheap as possible. So if you say, this is an important thing, we need this, it's expensive, what is the cheapest way to make this expensive thing? That is a reasonable constraint. So we are not trying to say cheap is equal to ugly. We are trying to say cheap has a value added to it. Often, the cheapest is the lightest of that material. So if we had, let me try to find a thing. Okay, so we have a Sharpie and we have a fine liner. It's probably hard to tell, but the Sharpie's much bigger than the fine liner. If both of these could support the load, why would we get the heavier one when the cheaper one, the lighter one, will do the trick? So engineering in Canada, there's a very specific requirement we're given. We have to design our buildings to meet the National Building Code of Canada, Part 9, and any other provincial and municipal requirements. So provincial for us in Ontario is the Ontario Building Code. Again, Part 4. Part 4 is the structural component of the Canadian codes. Architects are usually working within Part 3. The structural engineer is usually working within Part 4. There is a Part 9 that has some structural component in it, but that's what you do when you don't design. If you want to just look things up in a table and you meet the constraints of Part 9, you can use Part 9. We're not here to talk about Part 9. We're here to talk about Part 4. You will see there are some spots in these lectures where I say, hey, if you were doing Part 9, this is what you would do. But that is not what we're doing here in this course. All right. So when you're designing, and this is a hard thing to get people's heads around, architects and engineers, precedent doesn't mean crappy. Precedent means that it has proven to work, and unless you have a good reason to do otherwise, why would you not use the precedent? It's probably the cheapest, it's probably the quickest, and it's probably the easiest. So cheap, quick, and easy. That, without any other constraints, is really our goal. So understand the precedent and use it when you can. If you can't, take the precedent and tweak it or change it to meet your new constraints. And it's only if those things don't work that you would innovate. Don't start with innovation. And this is not me telling you not to innovate. I'm not trying to say I don't love innovation. But there's no need to innovate with a precedent that works and there's no problem using your precedent, especially considering your innovation's probably going to be expensive, take a long time, and be pretty difficult to do. So understand your precedent, refine as appropriate, and innovate when necessary. All right, structural design in 6 steps. This isn't something I'm testing you on. This is just kind of a thought process about where the architect and the engineer fit in this process. So the very first thing is step 1, and that's you guys, the architect. You are picking your system and figuring out the building and layout. So pretty much a huge chunk of it. When you hire an engineer, you already usually have a building almost fully conceived. So you've picked your material and you've done a layout of your building. The second step, you've probably even come up with a plan, a set of drawings that you go to the client with. Now, sometimes you might have hired an engineer by this point, but usually not. And what you've normally done is done some member sizing based on rules of thumb or sizing guidelines. And we're going to talk about those sizing guidelines within this course. They're going to be your best friend for a long time. I know that I've run into architects that I taught kind of the first year I was teaching, and they've told me that they still use those sizing guidelines. So now you've definitely hired the engineer, and they're taking over a little bit. So the engineer figures out everything that acts on the building or the loads. So what's on this building? Now, you see, I have maybe the architect as well, because I can only do what would be normal for a normal building. If there is something unusual, I need to know from you guys that it's unusual. So what do I mean by that? So the Goldring Center for Varsity High Performance Sports building, it was an unusual building, structurally anyway, where it was a 5-story building spanning 54 meters over a big gym. So no columns, nothing coming down to the ground in the middle of this building. Normally, so the top floor was offices and kind of science labs for sports activities. So they had an MRI. Now normally MRIs go in the basement of a building because they're very sensitive to vibration. So you put them in the basement on the concrete slab where nothing moving around is going to disturb them. Instead, in this building, we put it on the 4th floor of a large span building. And then, so this building, this element that does not like vibration at all, and then directly underneath it, hung from the bottom of the floor that the MRI was sitting on, we had hangers and another floor, and on that floor we had an Olympic weightlifting unit. So I don't know if you've ever seen Olympic weightlifters, but those are the people that take the big ones and lift them up over their head and hold it. There's lots of grunting, and then they throw it on the ground, and it bounces really high on the ground. So maybe the most vibration-y thing you can imagine, hung, which is also unusual in a building, hung underneath the floor of a thing that doesn't like vibration at all. That was an unusual loading requirement. So that the architect made very clear. They didn't know how to solve it, but they knew it was unusual. So they brought that to us as a problem to solve. We came up with some really cool things. And when I've given the tour of the building, it's been kind of fun to, like, you have people standing on each side of the floor, and you make them do the weightlifting thing, and some people feel the vibration and some don't, because we basically carved out a portion of the floor and completely isolated it from vibration. So step 4, again, this is the engineer. What do the loads do to every member, connection, and system in the building? So we look at every member in the building, every combination of those members in the building, and then how those members connect together. So we're going to go through some stuff this term, and we're going to do one member at a time. And by the end of this term, we'll probably have looked at 15 members. If you think about a building as a whole, it probably has, 500 members, and then each end is a connection, and then some of those things work in combination to do other things as systems. So you can imagine that doing it by hand starts to get very complicated. Luckily, we have software now that does a lot of this for us, but we have to understand what we're doing with it. And I always say to people that you should be able to pick a few elements and represent that by a hand calculation. So I never trust the output without also doing some hand calculations and see if at least a representative sample of things throughout my building match what my hand design expectations are. And then the engineer goes through the process, and maybe we'll ask the architect some questions, and we find a member that is stable, strong enough, and stiff enough to meet all of those loads. So we figure out what all of the internal loads are on all of those things, and then we check and see if the elements we've picked work. Are they strong enough? Are they stiff enough? And are they stable? And then maybe the architect says, oh, that one's too big, or we've moved this around, or we've changed the length of this, or we have to increase the story height here. So you have to go back and go through the whole process again several times. And that's usually the normal iteration of the design process. So what does structural design mean to you, the architect? Well, you'll need to know how to pick the best system. Now, best is, not literal. There's always different ways to do things, but the best system for your needs. But that usually means the cheapest and then the smallest within your constraints. The best layout, so that means what are the constraints that the owner has given you. And you'll need to know the approximate sizes. So that would be the rules of thumb or the sizing guidelines. So here's the cool thing though. You guys have secret weapons that engineers don't have. You guys get exposed to precedent. So many cool precedents. Engineers don't look at an actual building pretty much ever. I don't remember looking at a building as a whole in the entirety of my schooling. When I started working on the first day, I was blown away by how much I didn't know about how a building comes together. I knew how to design a beam, I knew how to design a column, but I didn't know how to bring those things together. You know how all the cool buildings come together and what they look like. But if you talk to an engineer and say, that cool nervy building, or a Renzo project. An engineer, unless they've worked with them, probably doesn't know what you're talking about. The other cool thing you have is sizing guidelines. What's up, bud? What you doing? Oh, poopy diaper.
He showed me where I throw it out.
Oh, it's way far in the back. Sorry, Shannon, I didn't mean to make you change poopy diapers. We have help today and tomorrow, so I'm very, 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 very grateful for it. I just need to check and make sure.
Hi.
Well, I just turned it on. Say hi.
Hi.
Who are you?
I'm Malcolm.
How old are you?
I'm 5.
And what's your favorite thing in the world to play with?
Number blocks.
Do you love numbers?
Yes.
So much. All right. Go, go, go. Okay. Okay, so the sizing guidelines is your other secret weapon. We'll go over these for steel, wood, and concrete. What it does is it gives a very simplified guess at what member you'll need to do that job. It's not the right answer, but often once the actual structural math analysis by the engineer has been done, you're going to find it's a pretty close guess. Why do you need to do it? Because it's a really good placeholder to draw in your drawings. So often you're doing a set of drawings early on, and if you drew beams that were this deep, and you went through, it's a 5-story building, and you have really tight height clearances, and you draw all of your beams this deep, and when you hire the engineer, you come back and you find out you need beams that are this deep on all 5 stories, so you've missed out on this much depth within your building, and when you build that in so that people don't bonk their heads on the beams, you've gone over your height limit, which means you have to chop off a whole floor of your building. All of a sudden the owner can't afford it with the rental space that they have in the building, and the whole project gets cut. That's obviously an extreme version of it, but that's what we're trying to avoid, and that's what you're trying to avoid. So knowing that you needed a beam this deep, maybe it ends up being this deep, maybe it ends up being this deep, but it's not a drastic difference. So it's a really good placeholder on where to start. The final design will probably be pretty close to it, assuming you're in the world of normal things. If you're doing something unusual, the sizing guidelines aren't going to be as helpful for you. Sizing guidelines make wonderful exam questions. So we'll come to those later in the term. Okay, let's just go over a few quick math things. I know some of you are probably deathly afraid of math. Some of you might not have done math in years and years and years. Maybe your undergrad was a fine arts degree or a history degree. Those are amazing things, and it brings such vision to the architecture world, but we can't escape the math in this course. I try to keep it as simple as possible, but I've made a list here of all the things you should be able to do, and they're gonna get easier and quicker as we go through the term. The stuff that maybe gave you palpitations on day 1, you're gonna be knocking it out of the park on the last days of the term. So don't stress about it too much. You can look these things up if you want. I'm going to give you some examples and show you some stuff. You can look these up and kind of get good at practicing through them if you're the sort of person that would like to do that. Okay, it sounds crazy, but we're going to talk about calculators. Exponents, squares and square roots, the basic trig functions, how to look things up on a chart, how to look things up on a graph, how to interpolate from a chart, how to solve for x, how to rearrange an equation, how to put 2 or more equations together, and units. Now, some of these I won't look at explicitly, and we will do throughout the term. And some of them you'll see, like even in our trig functions, when I kind of review the basic trig functions, we rearrange them to solve for the unknown we want to solve for. Okay, like I said, some of you are terrified of math, and I kind of found this, and it really struck me that my partner Dave and I, as much as we spend all our time doing math, every now and then we have to go to first principles, and we have to, do integrals from, like, we're 3rd order integrals or something like that. And even then, I am terrified of math sometimes. When I was in university, in the engineering department, engineers, you might not know this, but engineers like to be right all the time. We're not good at being wrong. And so a lot of them came into the program, including me, being a know-it-all. And so they purposely built into the curriculum the "we will break you" course. Most of them had never gotten a bad mark in anything in their life. So they purposely made it so that everyone would fail. Everyone fails that course. You can do everything you do at your best and you will fail that course. It is impossible to pass. And then they take the highest mark and set it as 100 and scale the course accordingly. I got a 40 on the exam and I was in the top 10%, and so I felt really good about that day. But there was a lot of sobbing throughout that course, so I get it. I respect the fear of math. Okay, let's give some quick math refreshers and then we'll jump into the actual lecture. Again, today is really light. We're going to ease into it. I don't want it to be hard either because I've got all the chaos to do, and I was supposed to be, Dave and I together, we were supposed to be doing the book launch in the Maritimes for Barry Sampson today. But obviously with the kids, I can't participate in it. Dave was one of the writers within the book. Some of you have probably seen the book, and it's a heartbreak that none of you will get to experience his mentorship at the school, because he was such a lovely individual and had so many great things to offer. Oh, now I'm going to get weepy. Sorry. Okay, math. All right, exponents. The base is the b and the exponent is the n. So b squared, third, fourth, or to the power of n, an unknown variable. So these are our two variables. 5 to the power of 4, we're saying 5 times 5 times 5 times 5. Malcolm knows his exponents up to 20. That was his COVID task that he decided to learn. I'm going to stress that I did not make the child learn those things. This was his own initiative. I had to install a calculator on his tablet because he would follow me around making me do the exponents. And I gotta say, I didn't know them off by heart over 13. And I was like trying to rake and do exponents in my head. It was driving me insane. And so he's since taught himself the exponents so squared, everything squared, so up to 20 squared. And cubes, he knows up to 9 cubed. We'll see what he does with this. I don't know. Okay, roots. Basically, it's the opposite of exponents. We're not going to get into complex numbers for those of you who have ever even heard about a complex number. So what we're saying is what number, or what would the opposite of it have been? So, so the fourth root of 625, basically what number timesed itself 4 times to give 625? So root 4 of 625. So that would have been the 5 by 5 by 5 by 5 gave us 625. I know most of you know this. I'm just trying to flesh it out and calm down the people who get worried about the math here, because I've already had emails from people worried about the math, and so I just want to calm everyone down. So most of you have a scientific calculator of some sort. We're not going to use a lot of the buttons on it, but we will use some. And so I would, I think this is like $15. I recommend you have a scientific calculator. Yes, I know your iPhone. If you pick calculator, my phone is apparently having a meltdown. Wow, it didn't like that at all. Here. For most of you, if you have your phone like this and turn it on its side, it will turn into a scientific calculator. The iPhone calculator, I don't know what it is, but the buttons, I don't know if my fingers, whatever, I have to punch everything in 5 times. I have to redo it so many times. I much prefer my calculator. I can't always tell you what way your calculator works, because some you have to press the second function option first and some you have to press it second. So every calculator is a little bit different, but that's, you want usually one that has a second function button. So you can see this calculator died on me, so this is the kind of next generation of the same one. So sometimes, like you can see, this is my b to the n or y to the x. They usually have the default of squared and cubed. There's the square root, but then they also have cubed root and x root. Math. Scientific notation. We're going to write some of our large numbers in scientific notation. So 1 times 10 to the 12, 1 times 10 to the 13, or 1 to the 3, 1 times 10 to the n. Okay, so 5 times 10 to the 3 is 5,000. Basically, we're saying we're moving our decimal place over 3 spots. 1, 2, 3. 5 times 10 to the minus 4, we moved our decimal place 4 places the other way. 1, 2, 3, 4. 5 times 10 to the 12, well, we've moved our decimal place 12 times. A lot of engineering stuff, we keep these to the 3s for whatever reason. So 3, 6, 9, and 12. So we might end up with not just a simple 1-digit number here if we keep it in the 3 to the power times 10 to the power of 3, 6, 9, or 12. And you'll see what I mean when we look at some of our charts later on. If you're using Excel, it'll often put an E here to represent the times 10 to the, and then put the number here. So this is 5 times 10 to the 6. So we moved our decimal over 6 spots. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Significant figures. These are the digits that carry meaning. So 5.2 pounds has 2 significant digits. 1.54 times 10 to the 4, when we know that could have had 4 zeros here, this has 3 significant figures. 1, 2, 3. 1,100 kilograms. It's not clear to me. There's at least 2 significant figures, but there could be 3 or 4. It depends on what the context is, so it won't always be obvious. The problems I've given you in the assignment this week, it's very obvious. Often we're going to stick with 3 or 4 significant figures in this class. And in your assignments, I will say how many decimal points I want to see in your answer, because Quarkus is very, very finicky about that. And I usually build in a rounding error for you. So if I said that we only want 2 decimal places and the answer had 3 decimal places, so you have to round up or you have to round down, I usually build in a good buffer for you there. So here's your scientific notation. There's 2 ways to do it usually. So exponent or times 10 to the power of. All right, right-angled triangles. I always say if it's not a right angle, it's a wrong angle. So you guys probably remember your right-angled triangles. We often called the one opposite the right angle the hypotenuse. And then we would often pick an angle and say we had the opposite side or the adjacent side. Not what we need for this problem that we're going to look at, but the next one. All right, so what do we know about a right-angled triangle? The first beautiful thing is Pythagorean's theorem. All right, in a right-angled triangle, we've just, so O and A, or I could call this Bob and I could call this Tim. The squared, the sum of these sides squared equals this side squared. So O squared plus A squared equals H squared. If we knew any 2 of these sides, we can rearrange this equation to find what we need. So if we know O and A, we know that the square root of O squared plus A squared will equal H, or the square root of the sum of the squares. You'll often hear engineers say that all the time because we use it as a technique in a lot of things. So we can rearrange it. So here's our H. It's the square root of A squared plus O squared. So we can arrange, if we knew H and A, O equals the square root of H squared minus A squared. So we can figure out, with any 2 of these sides, we can figure out the third side. What else do we know about a right-angled triangle? Well, I always called it SOHCAHTOA. Someone one time came to me with another name for it that I had never heard, and it blew my mind. But I'm going to call it Sakatoa. Or we're saying that, again, O is the opposite side. So we're picking an angle. So we could pick this angle or we could pick this angle. If we pick this angle, this is the opposite side, and this is the adjacent side, and this is the hypotenuse. In a right angle triangle, the sine of the angle is opposite over hypotenuse. The cosine of the angle is the adjacent over the hypotenuse. And the tangent of the angle is opposite divided by adjacent. And I cannot stress this enough. Make sure your calculator is in degrees. If you have it in a different method of gradients or radians, you will be absolutely effed. Because sometimes they can end up with a pretty close answer, just enough to screw you up. A lot of times it'll be totally obvious why you're getting wonky answers, but not always. So we can rearrange this to find the thing we need. So if I took the sine of the angle equals opposite divided by hypotenuse, if I want to know what the angle is, I take the sine inverse of opposite divided by hypotenuse. If I knew the hypotenuse and the angle, the opposite side is the hypotenuse times the sine of the angle. How do you punch this bad boy into your calculator? Well, it's usually directly above whatever. Is it going to focus on this? No, it doesn't want to focus on that for you guys. Anyway, it shows up on the next slide, but you have to use a second order function on your calculator. So make sure your calculator is in degrees. If you want, here are some worked out problems that you can solve. If you know you struggle with this stuff, you just cover this up and cover these up, and then you can go through and find your solutions. All right, a graph. Seems pretty simple. Most of you intuitively know this stuff, but the second I make you do it, you panic and you forget how. So that's why I just want to talk you through it a little bit. So we have a graph that has length on the bottom axis and weight on the vertical axis. So horizontal is length, weight is vertical. And we want to know what weight is associated with a length that is 5.4 meters. So if we came along here and we said, okay, 5 is somewhere in here. 5.4 is somewhere along here. So if that's 5, that looks like it's about 5.4. So we come up to here and come across, looks like about 30 kilograms. So for a length that's 5.4, we have 30 kilograms. What about that same data on a chart? So really, these are just the data points that were used to create this chart. So look, there's 4 with a data point, 5 with a data point, 6 with a data point, 7 with a data point, and then they drew straight lines in between these. So these are the things we know for a fact. Anything in between these is hazy. We often say you can linearly interpolate between those 2 points. It's not exactly right, but interpolating might give us a bit better than this. But this is an approximation. I am going to tell you that linearly interpolating is still also an approximation. It's a slightly more exact interpretation though. All right, so we want to know what weight is associated with 5.4 meters. Well, we know that 5 meters is 25 kilograms and 6 meters is 36 kilograms. So we have those 2 data points. We want to know what is 5.4. Do you think 5.4 is going to be closer to 25 or 36? Probably intuitively, no, it's going to be closer to 25. I like to do that so that I can kind of get my head around it and know if I ended up with 35 as the answer, I probably did something wrong. So you figure out the difference between these two, and you figure out the difference between these two, and then you basically just make a ratio of those. You can go through this problem and solve it. I find talking it through only confuses people. Intuitively, you often know how to do this. Look up interpolation, practice with a few problems. You're gonna get the hang of it. Most of you intuitively already know how to do this. But we got 30 kilograms on the chart. The exact imprecise answer is 29.4. So some people like to do a triangle to help them interpolate. Here's just a slightly more worked out version of that same problem for those who might struggle. What are some of the units that we're going to be talking about? Because we do have to convert between units. So length, we're going to be working almost exclusively in metric, except some things will be given to us in feet and inches. Because a lot of residential or wood framed construction, the drawings are still done in imperial, which is a total pain in the butt, but it is pretty standard for those types of projects. We will often, for wood projects, need to convert to metric to do our analysis. So 1,000 millimeters is 1 meter, 1 inch is 25.4 millimeters, and 12 inches equals 1 foot. I'm sure these are all things you know. Force or mass, depending on how you talk about it, 1 kilonewton is 1,000 newtons. 1,000 newtons is 102.06 kilograms, and that is about 224.8085 pounds, but we'll often use 225 pounds in our calculations. So if we need to convert something from pounds to newtons or kilonewtons, we'll use 225 pounds. Pressure. 1 MPa is 1 newton per millimeter squared. 1 MPa is 1,000 kPa. So that means 1 kPa is 1 kilonewton per meter squared. Moment. We're going to be dealing in moment. You don't even know what that is yet, but it's a kilonewton meter, not kilonewtons divided by meters. There is no divide symbol here. It's a kilonewton meter. So those are multiplied by each other. 1 kilonewton meter is 1,000,000 Newton millimeters. And we will convert back and forth between these two things. Not so much this term, but next semester or next year when we do structures 2, we are going to convert back and forth between these two all the time. In almost every problem we do, we're going to convert back and forth between these two. Okay, I'm going to take a quick break and then I'm going to come back. Okay, let's talk about strength, stiffness, and stability. Now, I always say that everything you need to know about structures, you already know. I'm going to tell you a bunch of stuff that's going to completely mess with your head, make you second guess everything you intuitively know, and then we're going to try to put it all back together. But I'm going to give you a really good recommendation. No matter what we do in this course or the next, before you do a single calculation, don't even do any math, take a guess at what you think the outcome is going to be, because you often already have a pretty good understanding of the problem. So we're going to go through that with strength, stiffness, and stability. And you're going to see that I'm going to try to remind you when we do problems to take a guess and just write it off in the corner. That way you'll know if you get an answer that doesn't match your expectation, you'll know you probably made a mistake in the math somewhere, because your intuition about structures is really, really good. Most so with stability. Intuitively, you have a pretty good understanding of when something isn't stable. So we're going to break up strength, stiffness, and stability for this lecture, but they can be related, or one can turn into the other's problem very quickly. The way we're going to talk about these is I'm going to show you images of failures of these things, because it's often very handy. Now, most of what we're going to talk about in Structures 1 and Structures 2 is strength. This is life safety. Now, stability is life safety too, but intuitively we often know when something's not stable, so we don't even get to the point where we need to engineer it, because we can tell pretty quickly if something's not stable. Stiffness is less about life safety, so it's very important. I can tell you that most of the lawsuits are about stiffness, but strength is about life safety. So strength, the amount of load a structure can sustain prior to failure. That could be rupture, excessive permanent deformation, or buckling. What are those things? You don't know yet. Maybe you do. If so, that's very exciting, but you don't really know what all of these things are yet, and we'll talk about them. Stiffness, the amount of force required to make a structure deflect by some fixed increment. Basically, how much does it move? Stability, and I don't mean move in space, I mean deform. So maybe I should use the word deform instead of move. Stability, the state of being stable, or the opposite of unstable. Instability can be elastic, ponding, tipping, or sliding. Worst definition ever. I understand that. But stability, do we have a system that won't move under load? That doesn't mean deform, but move. So if I have a pen like this, I would say it's stable. If I have a pen like this, it's not stable. If I was really, really good at not moving, that pen was stable for certain loads, but not others. What we want to do is make sure our pen doesn't fly off into space, or spin in space. Tipping is a way of one end of it flying off into space. If it tips, it's not stable because that end has flown off into space. It is not static. And static means staying still. We're going to talk about that later in the term. But stability, you have a pretty good sense for it. If you were up on a ladder, you would know that you need to get it in just a certain position or else it'll try to slide out from the bottom or tip over. There's a very funny balance there in getting a ladder to be stable. And intuitively, you understand that problem. And for every connection, every element, and every system in a building, we check that it's strong enough, that it's stiff enough, and that it's stable. So we check strength, stiffness, and stability for every connection, every element, and every system in a building. These make good exam questions or test assignment questions. All right. Do you see this? We don't use this anymore. This was a way we used to do design. We used to say we have a load on a system and we know what its capacity is, and we don't want it to be just strong enough. We want a little bit of a buffer in there. So what does that mean? All right. This is my table, and I'm sitting on my table. The material is wood, and it has some capacity to resist load. It's got to hold up the weight of the table itself, and it's got to hold up me. Now, what if I go out and eat a cheeseburger and have a beer, and I come back and we had made this table just perfectly strong enough to resist the load of Shannon? Well, if I go out and eat a burger and a beer, I'm now Shannon plus a burger and a beer, and I get up on this table and it collapses. That doesn't seem like a very well-designed table if there was zero buffer in there. So what we would do is we would often say, okay, I'm going to design it for 2 Shannons, or 3 Shannons, or 4 Shannons, or 5 Shannons. But we wouldn't have just done that. We would have said, okay, there's the weight of Shannon and the weight of the table. We're going to add those up, and then we're going to say we're going to design it for 4 times the weight of Shannon and the table together. But it's a little bit weird because the table's not going to get bigger. It might get a little bit bigger based on design, but we would know that when we went to check it. Maybe there could be a little bit of variation in the thickness of the table, but to be 4 times the weight of the table would be a bit weird. And so we've changed the way we did that. It didn't treat the unknowns of materials all the same, and it didn't treat the unknowns of, it treated the weight, sorry, it treated the unknowns built into the materials. It didn't treat that at all. And it treated the loads all the same way. So there was no variability in whether it was a live load or the weight of the table itself, me being alive, the live load. And it didn't do much about what the wood was capable of. We just had the capacity of the wood, and then we built it all into the loads. And we called that factor of safety. So we would take the load on the system and multiply it by a factor of safety, and that factored load needed to be less than the capacity. But the fact that it treated all the loads the same and didn't address the materiality at all, people found a bit problematic. So they came up with a new system, and this is the system that we use here in Canada. They use it in the United States. They use it in most European countries. That is called, well, here, let's go through it. Instead, what we say is, let's look at each load individually. We'll add them up, but we'll factor them independently. And we'll look at the material and we'll say, okay, we know that table is as strong as that table, but what if that table had a flaw in it? What if there was a knot in that table? What if there was something with that table? We reduce the capacity as well. So we factor up the load and we reduce the capacity. And this factored load needs to be less than the reduced capacity. Now, we like to name all things. So we factor the load, we reduce the capacity. We often use Greek symbols. This was less terrifying pre-COVID when we started giving Greek names to all of them. But we would factor up the load and reduce the capacity. You'll see this symbol get used a lot in structures too when we talk about the reduction factor for the material. And then we look at that for every type of load. Now, you guys don't know what these types of loads are, but for example, moment. Well, that capital M means moment, and a subscript F means I factored the load. We want the factored moment to be less than the reduced moment. If you see a little F here, it means we factored that load. If you see a little R here, it means we've reduced the capacity. Whether we're talking about axial loads, shear, moment, tension, compression, it doesn't matter. The F means it's been factored. The R means the material capacity has been reduced. And we want our factored load to be less than the reduced capacity. You're gonna hear me say this a gazillion times throughout the next year. We want the factored load to be less than the reduced capacity. We could take it almost to equal. In fact, it would be perfectly designed if these two things were equal. Now, we don't have the same danger of going out and eating a cheeseburger and beer and breaking the table, because that burger and beer has been built into the factored side of this. We don't have to worry about a flaw in the material or them not building it quite right, because we've taken that into the reduced capacity. So if we factor up the load and make sure it's less than the reduced capacity, we will be fine. This is called limit states design or limit state design. Sometimes you'll hear it called ultimate limit states design. It is not the same thing as the ultimate design case. That is something different. Limit states design has two components: ultimate limit states, which is all about strength, and serviceability limit strengths, which is all about stiffness. All right, what are these different loads that I talked about? I said, if there's the subscript F or the subscript R on that particular type of load case, we know or load type, what we're talking about. Or force type. I should say force type, not load type. So these are the different force types, not load, because load is what we're putting on the thing. So compression. Intuitively, you know what compression is. It's when we squash it. Tension, you know what tension is. It's when we stretch it. So this is kind of hard to stretch. Compression. Oh. What happened when I tried to compress this? That was weird. When I try to compress this, that doesn't happen. I'm pushing just as hard. That seems like something we'll have to talk about later. So compression, tension. Shear. Shear always messes with people. Shear is we're saying what happens, so these are my business cards here. We are saying what happens when this plane tries to slip past each other. Okay? So we have this side going down and this side going up. Those are trying to slip past each other. What happens there? And then let's go over another business card. We have to do the same thing. And we have to go over another business card and we have to do the same thing. And we're saying as we're looking at every single spot along the stack of business cards, and we're saying what is happening as these try to slip past each other. And for our member as a whole, we've sliced it up at every single part along its length to see what's happening as any two planes try to slip past each other. If it's a connection, it's usually not too bad. If we're taking a piece of steel and a piece of steel and trying to slide them past each other, it's very obvious where that plane is. If we've got a big long object like this, maybe we're trying to slip it along this plane, or along this plane, or maybe in the middle here. And so as those two planes, as we add more planes, if we talk about a gap between those, we start to get this skewing action. So you'll often see this shape when we talk about shear. Now look at this. This is really interesting as this happens. I had a square here, and here it looks like that is compressing on that angle. Where here, those two look like they're stretching apart from each other. When we see shear failures in concrete, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit, you'll see cracks along this line right here. And it gets, or I guess along this line right here. It gets really interesting as those two things try to pull apart, because concrete doesn't like tension, and we'll get a crack right there. Bending. A force that acts to bend a component, putting one side of that part in tension and the opposite side in compression. Remember when I looked at this beam and I bent it like this? We saw that the top squares squashed and the bottom squares stretched. And those all look like they stayed like straight lines along there. That's going to be a really cool thing to talk about in structures too. But the top is in compression and the bottom is in tension. What happens if I bend it this way? Well, now the bottom is in compression and the top is in tension. It looks like no matter what we do, we find some way to relate this to tension and compression. Torsion or torque is not a thing we're going to talk about in this course, but it's kind of this weird component of shear and moment about a different axis of the element. So you can see we get that same weird skewing that we got in our shear problem, but we also have a moment component to it. And we talk about it in kilonewton meters, the same way we do moment. Again, we're not going to do any work on this, but it's important to know that it's a type of force. Now, connections is a ductile or brittle combination of axial shear, bending, and torsion on local elements, or where they intersect with each other. All right, let's look at some failures, because that's really the best way, I think, to get your head around what's happening. Otherwise, it's just an object not doing anything. Okay, concrete is really strong in compression. So look here, this is literally how we check concrete. Every time we cast concrete, so every concrete truck you ever see go anywhere, when they pour that concrete, sitting in the front seat with them, they have a bunch of little cylinders and they pour these little concrete cylinders, and then they go back to the plant and they test them at 7 days, 28 days, and 56 days to see if the concrete strength matches what we told them they needed to make that concrete. So you can see it kind of pops out around the edges here. So it almost looks like the surface tension there failed. So here's timber in compression. Axial failures for tension. So you can see our steel pulled, steel does some interesting things. We'll look at videos about this next year when we talk about steel. But you can see, just like I did, they drew these little lines on this, and you can see every single one of those lines got some distance between them. Something weird happened here right where it failed, but that is not the same dimension that was originally. So there was original sizes, and then there was the final sizes. Shear. So this is what I was saying. It's really easy to see in a connection. So you can see the two steel plates slip past each other. In something in bending, we still have shear happening. It's just not often as obvious to us. Concrete is very susceptible to shear. So a concrete beam, when we bend it, will often have these diagonal cracks that propagate along it. And that is a clear indication of shear failure in concrete. Now, there's other types of shear concrete failure, which is called punching failure. We're going to look at that in a minute. But in a bending element, this is a shear failure in concrete. Here are shear failures in concrete walls and a concrete block wall. This might have just been cast concrete with board form on it. Now look, we've got that classic diagonal failure, and in this one we have it in both directions. Anyone want to guess what different events caused both of these things? It looks like this one had a failure where one side tried to slip past each other, and that was it. This one looked like it slipped that way, and then it slipped this way, and then it slipped that way, and then it slipped this way, and then it slipped that way. Can anyone think what two different phenomena might have caused this? Well, this one was a windstorm of some sort. Now, it could have been the same as this one, and we'll talk about it in a second, but often this is a pretty distinct failure, and we'll come back to that. Wind usually has very high loads in one direction. Now, obviously, there's hurricanes and tornadoes, but those are so isolated and they're usually not acting on the building as a whole over its entirety. Even a hurricane would usually have higher winds on one side of the hurricane versus the other. I'm from Halifax, and as much as I didn't live there when it happened, when Juan went over Halifax, people who lived went right through the eye. There was certain trees that went down in one direction and then certain trees that went down in the other direction. But even still, the wind is usually the highest on one side. So this was a windstorm. This was an earthquake, because earthquakes often with the same force will make your building shake back and forth. So this is very distinctly an earthquake failure. Punching shear. So punching shear in slabs is a real problem. And that is when the concrete slips down past the column. If you took Jell-O and tried to hold up a block of Jell-O on a toothpick, you know it would slip down. Yeah, there's also soup in the fridge in the back room.
What would you like?
The pulled pork shepherd's pie. If you tried to hold up a block of Jell-O on a toothpick, you know it would slip down. That is a punching shear failure. This is, I don't want to talk about recent failures in case it's sensitive to anyone, but you can see here that they put things at the top of these columns. Often we'll put capitals or dropped slabs to try to increase the thickness locally around the column to prevent that punching shear phenomenon. Bending failure. So remember, bending failure, or a bending, is when we have one side in compression and one side in tension. So here, they are supporting it here and they're pushing down here. And you can see that this wood snapped at the bottom where it was in tension. So that wood had a tension failure at the bottom due to a bending failure. This is a concrete beam. These aren't the supports. These are the loading elements. This concrete beam is actually much larger than what's being shown in this photo. And so what we have here is a support here like this, and it's pushing up on it. So the top is in tension and the bottom is in compression. Concrete does not like tension at all. So you can see these are tension failures in concrete. And this is a compression failure in our concrete. Steel is a ductile material. So it might not rupture the way our wood and our concrete does. It might start to deform and then keep deforming and keep deforming and deform so much that it's no longer useful. So it turns from a strength problem into a serviceability problem into a stability problem. Because you can see this would fall right off of its supports. As much as we're not going to talk about torsion, I wanted to show you torsion failure. If anyone has taken off the top of a screw head with an impact driver, you know that you've probably said that you sheared the head off. Well, it's really a torsion failure, but we often talk about it as a moment shear combination. So you've sheared off the head, even though what you've really done is torqued off the head. So here's a steel shaft. So this would be some sort of drilling rig of some sort. So here is a screw in shear. Now, we said that that's the act of these two things slipping past each other. If I put a screw through there, one side tries to go up and one side tries to go down. So that goes up and that goes down. And in this one, that went up and that went down. And it deformed it in that diagonal failure that I talked about. So here's a close-up of a beam in shear. This likely wasn't an under-designed situation. What often happens when they're installing steel, because the boom that's lifting the steel into place is the really, really, really expensive part of the construction, they'll often have someone just follow along, they'll hoist a beam in, and they'll put a bolt in. Now, for the self-weight of the beam, one bolt's probably just fine. They might even put two in. And then the idea is later they'll just hire the cheapest person they've got in their crew to go back and finish putting all of those bolts in. And then they'll start building the rest of the building on top of their steel. My guess, now it's always hard to go back and analyze something from a picture, is that this was a condition where they didn't come back and put the screws in. This is a plate in tension where they actually managed to pull it apart. Here is an anchor that has pulled out. Now, what's happened here is this column tried to tip over. And down here, we had two anchors close together. And as it tried to tip over, it forced it to bend a little bit there. This side pulled up out of the ground and this side squashed down. What would happen if I turned this and separated those columns out a little bit? Do you think it would be able to resist more or less load? Intuitively, you know that if something's trying to tip over, you spread out the bottom of it. So if you try to stand, I wonder if you guys can even see me. If you tried to stand balanced on your toes and someone tried to tip you over, you'd tip over very easy. You spread your feet flat and you're a little bit better. Spread your stance apart when somebody tries to tip you over. It's a lot harder. What you've done is you've understood implicitly how to resist a moment. And we're going to talk a lot about this. We're going to draw pictures of it, and you're going to get yourself all confused. But intuitively, you understand how to resist moment. So stiffness. So stiffness is not a life safety problem. Strength is about preserving life. We want people to live if something happened. Stiffness, as much as it's not about life safety, it is the thing we get sued about all the time. People hate seeing cracks in their finishes, they hate seeing something wrong, and they assume that it means that there's some major problem. Sometimes there might be a major problem, and sometimes it might be not that big of a deal. but I would say probably, what would you say, Dave? 90% of the lawsuits are about stiffness in some form?
Probably.
So we can have different types of stiffness issues: vertical, horizontal, rotational. We can worry about soil, and then vibration. Vibration's often its kind of own category, but sometimes for certain purposes we'll lump it in with with stiffness. Don't worry about this definition. I almost even hate that I have it in here. Sometimes we'll talk about stiffness using a variable K. Stiffness is the inverse of flexibility, really. So we're saying if it's stiff, it's not flexible. If it's flexible, it's not stiff, is really all I'm trying to explain here. Most of you understand flexibility. This is a flexible material. It's very easy for me to move it around versus that same blob out of steel. It would have been very stiff, and I wouldn't have been able to manually make that.
I'll join on my computer as soon as I can.
Sorry, we're both trying to work in our dining room together, and then the kids doing online school. We're often maxed for desk time without annoying each other. Do you want me to finish up that food? I can stop if you need me to, Dave. He's deaf in one ear, so he has a phone to his good ear and he can't hear me now at all. Do you want me to finish that up? Do you want me to finish that up?
That'd be great, sure.
Okay. Sorry. Sometimes you're going to find things are a little bit scattered around here. We're all just coping. If you watch this straight through without stopping it, then you can judge me. If you stop at all, please have sympathy for what I'm trying to do as well by working from home with this. So stiffness and flexibility are just an inverse way of talking about something. You understand what flexibility means. Stiffness is just talking about it in the opposite way. So what sets the guidelines for stiffness? Just use food in the microwave. Okay, I'm gonna stop and I'm gonna come back when I can focus a bit better. So when we're talking about stiffness, what sets the guidelines that we're trying to meet for stiffness related issues? So strength, we looked at the load on it versus the capacity of it, and we factored up the load and we reduced the capacity. But for stiffness, we know it's about something different. It's not about life safety. So what are these guidelines? Well, what sets these things? Well, there's comfort. How comfortable are people? If you're standing on a floor that bows, you're not going to enjoy it very much. Preservation of finishes. People don't like to see things cracking. A lot of the reviews we get called in for things are usually because there's cracking in drywall. Very, very, very rarely is it ever actually something structural. Stiffness can be related to stability, which seems crazy because we have a whole other stability problem. But it's when the stiffness of the element can turn into a stability problem. And so drainage is tied with that. We need to be able to drain water to certain places. And then interface with building elements. So we don't want one part of the building able to move a lot and the rest not able to move much, because then you'll see cracks or problems appear in your element. So interface with building elements, a really good example would be windows, for example. Our building is allowed to move a little bit, but a window, a piece of glass, is very, very, very rigid. It can't move at all. It can't move while the building moves. So what we do is we build a little, almost like, it's a frame. It's a frame that we sit the glass in, and there's a little bit of play. So that frame can skew with the building, but the glass stays in it. And what we want to make sure is that we know how much the building moves so that it doesn't move so much that it squashes the glass and breaks it, or that it moves so much And we've built the shoe big enough, but the glass pops out of it. So we're talking about how do we preserve the finishes on this building and interface with building elements. So these are some calculations you're going to do in your assignment this week. These are the serviceability limits, or the stiffness limits on beams that we will put on things. So this is a quick overview of the guidelines. Each different material code has more in-depth guidelines. So Dave has stolen my steel one, but this is the wood handbook. And this data right here comes from this book. And I have gone through each of the codes and assembled it here for you in one handy sheet. And now each of the codes has different criteria for different situations. We say, let's say for the roof, for example, are we talking about snow by itself or the self-weight and the snow together? And then, are there finishes that are susceptible to damage or are they not susceptible to damage? So drywall, susceptible to damage. Plaster, anything that cracks is susceptible to damage. So no ceiling, so a big steel warehouse, for example, does not have finishes that are susceptible to damage. You put a drop ceiling in there, if it bends too much or there's too much deflection, those panels pop out of their frame. So that is susceptible to damage. So then we look at what material we have, and this is L divided by our criteria, or the length of the beam divided by our criteria. Masonry over here is L divided by 480, so a really tight criteria, but we also limit it to 20 millimeters, so 3/4 of an inch, the maximum we ever let anything that's supporting masonry deflect, because masonry shows cracks so easily. If you've ever walked around outside an old building, you will find cracks in the mortar joints of those block walls. So I can promise you there are good exam questions from this list. You're going to do some in your assignment. Let's take a look at what these are. So let's take a look at what this means, and then we'll do an example. So we're saying this is the length of the beam, and this is how much we're saying will allow it to deflect. We often talk about this dimension in millimeters. If we're talking about a cantilever, so forget all of this back here, we're just talking about this cantilever, we either take our criteria and divide it by half or double the length we're talking about. Because if we double the length of the cantilever, it looks like a regular beam. Okay, here's an example. Let's go through this example. What is the amount of live deflection we will accept for a wood floor beam with drywall that spans 10 feet and has a 2-foot cantilever? Well, drywall right there, that is telling us that it's susceptible to damages. They've said we're not worried about the dead and live combination, we care about the live deflection all by itself, and it's a wood beam and it's a floor. So it looks like that's everything we have to pick the criteria. So wood floor beam with drywall for live load. Let's go back. So floor, live, susceptible to damage, and it's wood. So length divided by 360. We need to convert our 10 feet and our 2 feet to millimeters because we're going to want these deflection criteria in millimeters. So the back span was 10 feet, so we're going to take that 10 feet, 10 times 12, because there's 12 inches in a foot, times 25.4 millimeters, because there's 25.4 millimeters in an inch. And we get 3,048 millimeters. Okay, for the live delta criteria, so delta just means deflection or change. The live criteria wood floor with finishes is the length divided by 360. So the allowable deflection, or the amount, the serviceability limit, or the amount we'll let this beam deflect right here, is 3,048 millimeters divided by 360, or 8.47 millimeters. So that is the serviceability limit on this part of this beam. we also have to check this cantilever. So the cantilever is 2 feet, or 2 times 12 times 25.4 to get 610 millimeters. The cantilever deflection criteria for a wood floor with finishes, remember, we could either double the length or divide the criteria by 2. So I'm going to take that L divided by 360 and divide it by 2 and get L divided by 180. So my allowable deflection is 610 millimeters divided by 180, or we can have 3.4 millimeters of deflection. In the assignment, I will say, please write your answer to so many decimal places. So this one, I might have said, write it to 2 decimal places. If I only said write it to 1 decimal place, your answer is 8.5 millimeters. Oh, just going back to that, if I said 2 decimal places, and this is the answer of 3.4, when you try to put in the 0, it will delete it from Quercus. It doesn't mean you're wrong. If the 0 is supposed to be there and I ask for 2 decimal places, it'll look like Quercus is erasing it, but don't worry about that. It doesn't keep it in there, but it knows you have the right answer. Assuming that was the right answer. Okay, serviceability limit for lateral loads. So this is how much can our building move under wind or earthquake. Now we have 2 criteria. We have each story and the building as a whole. So if this is the height of the building, for wind, there's a subscript W there, the deflection we let our building move is H divided by 500. So what if we had a 32-story building that was 3.2 millimeters each, so times 1,000. So that's, 100,000 millimeters divided by 500. We're allowing that building to move 8 inches, so 200 millimeters around there. So it's actually a lot of movement. Earthquake, we allow it to move even more. H divided by 50 or H divided by 100. So we allow a lot of movement for earthquake as long as everyone gets out alive. We don't care if a little bit of drywall gets damaged. We have it's such a rare event, and we accept a certain amount of loss due to an earthquake. So that's the building as a whole. What if we had a really stiff building and one story that was weak? Well, we limit that story as well. So we have to do that same check for each story. So the building as a whole might have met the criteria, but the height of this story divided by 500 might not have met its deflection criteria limit. Vibration. Okay. So a continuous vibration, if you're in an activity that causes a continuous vibration, we don't want our building to be at the same vibration as that. Or we don't want to have a vibration that could annoy humans. Now, a steady repeating load like dancing or music is often at 2.5 hertz. So humans typically move at 2.5 hertz. Stand up, and normally this is a lot better when everybody's in a room together. And I tell everyone to go up on your toes as slow as you can and down. It really burns the calves. And then I tell everyone to do it as quick as you can. Again, it starts to hurt. And then I tell everyone to do it just the amount that feels comfortable. And if you looked around, everybody might be moving at the same time, but they'd be moving at the same rhythm. And that's about 2.5 hertz. Oh, I need to stand up for the next thing. Okay. Buildings, we also don't like floors to we want them to dampen a load quickly. We don't want people to feel a transient vibration. So that's if, for example, you're going to see my camera move around there a little bit. So you saw that move around a little bit and then stop. One of the reasons it stopped so quickly, but you could hear my window rattle for a little bit longer, is that the arm of my video camera dampened the load from me dropping my heel. So it had a very large initial reaction and then it tapered off really quick. Whereas the window had a really large initial reaction and then it took a little bit longer for it to dampen out. So we like to have mass. We use weight often to help solve our dampening problem of vibration. So often we have concrete toppings on floors, specifically because it helps limit that annoyance of vibration through the floor. So if you have somebody running laps around a track, you don't care so much. But if you have somebody running laps around a track by your office, it's really going to start to be annoying. We also worry about amplification or resonance of a building or elements within a building. So in an extreme condition, it could even lead to failure. So this is what happens when either human movement or wind or seismic movement are at the same frequency of the object. And so if the frequencies are the same, they'll start to amplify and build on each other. If you've ever been walking on a steel pedestrian bridge, you're okay with a little bit of vibration. You accept a different standard of vibration than you do in a house, for example. You're okay with a little bit of vibration on a steel bridge, pedestrian bridge. If you've ever been walking across the bridge while somebody runs by, it feels very different. And I've also gone running on one of those steel bridges when you go to put your foot down and it feels like the bridge isn't there anymore because your vibration, you've started to meet the vibration of the bridge, and when your foot comes down, the bridge is dropped just a tiny little bit from where your brain expects it to be. Vertical deformation. Now, my old house, pre-kids, my husband and I lived in a very small, tiny shack of a building. Divorce is expensive, and this is what we had left to move in to our crappy little house. So when we were doing renovations, we had put all of our storage up in the ceiling space. We had laid planks down on the floor and tossed all our stuff up there because we had nowhere to put anything. When we decided to renovate and clean things up a bit, because this was a gross little building, we wanted to put windows in here. And when we took the finishes off, we saw that this beam that looked like it was a beam in here, as it should have been, that was picking up, so what you can't see off page here was that the floor goes back, because you can see my feet here, I'm up against the other wall. There was joists that spanned across that floor. So this beam was picking up half of all of that load that we put up there in the storage space. And what we found was, instead of a beam there was just a 2x4 on flat, a simple little 2x4 on flat. It had about a 50th of the capacity it needed to support the load that was there. Now, it obviously hadn't come crashing down, so you can see that we build in a lot of redundancy into things. But the deflection there was about 2 inches, and this was only like an 8-foot span, I think, or something like that, and we had 2 inches of deflection in it. So let's just see. So 8 times 12 times 25.4 is 2.438. Ceiling with finishes, let's just go with the 360. We would accept about 1/4 of an inch, and we had about 2 inches. So the serviceability criteria would have been about 1/4 of an inch, and we were seeing 2 inches. This is what it took to solve the problem. So we supported it with jacks, we put in new beams. These ended up being a 3-ply 2x8 or 2x10, I can't remember. I think it might have been a 2x8. So what that means is we had 3 2x8s that we stuck together and screwed together to make one big beam. And that's what it took to actually meet the criteria to support that load. This is a ceiling that did not meet serviceability criteria. You can see that the finishes are all cracked. So here's where I'm going to reiterate that drywall, or gypsum wallboard as it's often called, or sometimes we'll abbreviate it with GWB, is susceptible to damage. This is why masonry has the tightest deflection criteria. Here, our soil had differential settlement. So you can imagine maybe a water got under that footing and a little bit of sand moved away and it dropped just a tiny little bit, but that crack propagates right over and you end up with a very large visible crack. It doesn't kind of spread itself out over the system with a little bit here and a little bit here and a little bit here. It results in one very large visible crack. Here is a wall without reinforcing in the block wall, trying to resist soil. So here's the window well. There's soil on the outside of this, and that wall is bowing in to the basement. Lateral deformation for stiffness. Now this is a really common sight. Boathouses, wide open, half of the front of them is usually missing structure, and they tip over. We're going to talk a lot about lateral load resisting systems over the coming weeks, and this is a problem. We don't want our building to tip over like that. We want something that stops our building from tipping over like that. What we want is a lateral load resisting system. If you feel like it, watch this video. It's kind of a fun video of somebody being at the Taipei 101 building during an earthquake, well, a bunch of people, and you see the tune mass dampener activate. Everybody stays calm, surprisingly calm. I think I might have been freaking out. And they keep taking pictures. In fact, what's interesting is because the camera is mounted to the building, it doesn't look like the building's moving. The building is actually the thing moving. What you see is the tune mass dampener move and the people move. But the tune mass dampener is actually staying still and the building's moving around it. The one person who doesn't look like they're moving is the person who grabs onto the sign to take a picture, and they start looking like they're staying still. But remember, it's the building that's moving, and everybody's adjusting their position to not move. They're trying to stay upright while the building's moving around. This was a football stand collapse that happened not too long ago, where there's people in the stands cheering and they start stamping on the bleachers. And I don't know if it was the vibration caused the problem or it was just too much load, but they ended up collapsing the stadium. Here in Toronto, when the football team first came and they had the outdoor bleachers, they weren't expecting quite such a large fan base. And people started noticing that the bleachers were getting quite movie at the end of the first season, and they went back and found that the nuts were starting to loosen off. So they had to go in and weld the nuts on because the vibrations can actually back off nuts. Here's another video of a bridge collapse that you can watch if you want to. I'd play it right now, and sometimes I will play videos, but it causes a funny lag and you can't hear me. These are something you can watch on your own if you feel the desire. Stability. Okay, what are stability failures? What do they look like? Well, remember I said we want our building to be static. That doesn't mean that it doesn't deform. So deflection is something different. Static means it's not flying off into space. It deflecting a little bit is something different. Stability means it tips over, it slides. It could be thrown up in the air, but that's not often what a building does. It could be elastic, which I'll show you what that means, or ponding. There could be just no load path. Maybe you haven't done something right. You just haven't given anything to support it. If we had a cantilever like this, so you can see I've got two supports back here and there's a cantilever. If I just tried to make this a cantilever, there's no load path. If I wanted this to be a cantilever, I have to have a moment connection here. See how I have my hand gripping it? That can resist moment. If I just tried to support it, like you can see that if I want my normal beam to be stable, I can just support it on 2 pins, but if I take one side away, it's not stable because there's no load path. Remember when I talked about compression? When I squashed this way, it was fine. I squashed this. Remember when I squashed this way? It did that, and I said that's something we'd come back to. That is buckling. So compression will govern something that's stocky or short. Something that's tall and slender will be governed by buckling, and it's a stability problem, or it's related to stiffness. So for a column, we have overall buckling. For a beam, we have lateral torsional buckling. So that means I try to bend this beam. Remember, the top's in compression and the bottom's in tension. And if compression is the thing that's sensitive to buckling, look at this. The bottom stays fine and the top of it, or we'll call it the chord, the top chord, buckles. And then we have something called local buckling. And local buckling is when an element of an object starts to buckle. So if I had an I-beam or the flange of a beam, I normally have sketch paper here waiting to go. So if this is an I-beam, local buckling would be my husband's a much better drawer than I am. Local buckling is when just one element buckles. So you can see what happened to my flange here. It went whoop. The whole element, the whole beam didn't buckle, but one local part of it did. And so that would be local buckling. So sliding. Sliding is when the force pushing it sideways overcomes the weight holding it down against the friction. Don't worry about these too much. What I'm drawing here with these arrows is an early look at a free body diagram. We're going to get heavily into free body diagrams, and we're going to draw a lot of free body diagrams coming up. But this is kind of a first simple look at one. Tipping is when we have a big enough force. The friction is fine, it doesn't slide, but our weight might not be high enough and we tip over this point. So we have enough friction, but we also don't have enough weight to stop us from tipping over. So over our building goes. Elastic stability. So elastic stability, you can imagine I've got this object here and they build it just a little bit crooked. There's tolerance in everything. And so this gets built a little bit crooked. And this is a column, so it's supposed to have load on it. We've designed it so it won't buckle and it's strong enough. But they build it just a little bit crooked. Well, I put my load on it and it moves it a little bit. Well, now it's even more crooked. So I keep putting my load on and it moves even more, and then that load causes it to move. So what we do is we do an incremental check. We say, okay, I put the load on, what do I calculate it moves? And then once it's in this position, it has a tendency to move more. And I do the check again. If each time I do that check, the difference in the movement gets smaller, it's stable. If the increment between the changes gets bigger, we have an unstable or an instability problem. We're not going to do any work with this, so don't worry about it. It's rarely going to be a thing that you come across, but it can be a problem. Where it might come up with architects is a ponding problem. So let's take a look. I used to have this as an animation, right? I have it as a picture coming up. It's not a failure, but it shows what happens. So water fills up this roof and we get a little bit of deflection. Well, you can imagine now the water redistributes so that the most water is right here in the middle. And so now in the middle, we've got more water than we had originally. So it deflects a little bit more, which pools more water there, which means it deflects a little bit more. And so again, we do that same check. And if these increments, so that's the first increment, second, third, fourth. those increments are getting smaller. This is stable. We still have to check that it's strong enough and that it meets the stiffness criteria, but we also want to make sure we don't have a ponding problem. This one, the increments are getting larger. We don't have a stable system. This would keep deforming until we had a problem. So buckling, I showed this. This is an instability resulting from a compressive load on a column. Local buckling, that was the flange of the beam I drew. And so here's a close-up of that flange. So we're just looking at that flange locally. All right, let's look at some images of this, because like I said, I find the best way to get your head around these things is to actually look at images. A building doesn't tip very often. This was a weird set of circumstances. In my recollection, no one died from this. I might be mistaken. There might have been one death. So this was not an occupied building. This was a site under construction, and it happened overnight. What had happened was they had dug a big hole on one side. Now, when we deal with soil, and we're going to talk about this, if you dig a hole in soil, the other soil wants to fill in the hole. If you load something beside it, it really wants to fill in that hole. So if you've ever seen a hole dug in the beach and you went and stood beside it, and your arrival immediately causes it to cave in, you're a surcharge load. Well, what they did here is they dug a big hole on one side and they put all the soil on the other side of the building. And so it amplified a problem where now the whole building the soil became unstable and it tipped over the whole building. Gotta sneeze. Excuse me, sorry everyone. Again, this is a very unusual problem. We check it. We want to make sure our lateral systems are tied down into the ground. Sliding, again, not often a problem we deal with a building. So finding these pictures on the internet, trying to figure out the backstory, I cannot figure out what happened here. There might have been flooding at one point that moved the building, but it looks like I've driven through regions after they've been hit by a flood. They don't look like this. Maybe this was actually being transported on the back of a flatbed, but it looks like there's blinds in the window. You empty all the things out of the building, or it's never been, you move it before you ever live in it. So possibly a tornado, but again, everything else looks totally fine. So I don't know the story about this, but this is clearly slid here somehow. Okay, ponding. We often worry about ponding on a roof when we do renovations. So environmental mandates are usually that we need, and this is a big thing we're seeing right now with COVID, we need air filters and we need better mechanical units trying to pump the air through these buildings with better filters. Often in older buildings, the only place to put that stuff is on the roof. So we put it on the roof, and we've now added load to the roof. So we had a roof like this, it had a little bit of deflection, no problem. We put a mechanical unit, and it deflects more. No problem, we've checked it for the weight of the mechanical unit and any snow that might pile up around it. No problem. But when the rain falls, we've created a local low spot that was not part of the design. Normally the low spots are where the drains are. And unless the drain was right there anyway, we've probably created a low spot that didn't previously exist. So now we have water that's going to pool there, which is going to deflect it a bit more, which means more water is going to gather. And we have to do that repetitive check to see if that increment gets smaller or bigger. So here's a lateral torsional failure. So this was a beam that was in bending. And remember, things in compression, if they're slender, buckle. Tension's fine. So here's my beam, the top's in compression, the bottom's in tension, so the bottom's fine, but the top is in compression, so it pops out sideways. And that's exactly what happened here. So you can see it laterally buckled, and then because it buckled, it twisted. So we call beams that have a buckling problem, we say there's a lateral torsional problem. This is a buckling failure overall in a steel column. The whole column buckled. I'm going to show you the same image or the same test for a different column that had local buckling, just to help you see the difference between the two things. So this is when we were jacking that beam into place in my old house when we were renovating it, we were using a steel post to support things, but we noticed that using a car jack, that the wood was coming close to failure. So we decided, just for fun, we had laminated two 2x4s together, but they were still so slender. We said, all right, knowing that when this pops, it's going to be supported on this jack, so we don't care. For fun, let's see if us manually, just using a car jack, can buckle this 2-ply 2x4. So I, by myself, buckled a 2x4. There's a lot to take away in this. A, that we've got a buckling failure. We have a secondary load path. That's great. Look at this spreader beam. We've got this thing on the floor spreading that load out. But me, how was I possibly able to make this thing bust? Well, I was pushing down here. You understand that there's something about that relationship there, something about distance and force. And that's going to be really important when we start talking about moment. Buckling failures in railway tracks. Anyone who's ever taken the GO train knows that in the cold we worry about them getting brittle. But I've seen more trains delayed due to high temperatures than low temperatures. The reason is as it heats up, those rails try to expand. The only thing holding them in place are these nails in the ground, or the rail spikes. The train going across it could loosen these and make it pop and make the whole track buckle. So they often put speed reductions so that they slowly load up these tracks in high temperatures. So here's local buckling on this flange of this beam. You can see that the whole beam hasn't buckled sideways. We don't have a lateral torsional buckling failure. We have a local buckling. Just the flange is buckled. Here you can see local buckling of a flange. Oh, so this steel column, it started to bow out, but look at this. This side buckled and this side is still smooth. That is local buckling. Okay, here is a steel silo. Thin plate steel, that's local buckling, but then look, it buckled, and look what's happening. The top of that's starting to tip. We're going to turn into a P delta problem, or that stability problem of it tipping over. So we've got a local buckling that's turning into a P delta problem that's going to turn into a tipping problem. So you can see that these things feed into each other. It's not always obvious which one started it when you look at the thing at the end. So you can't always tell by looking at the finished failure what propagated what, because they often start to loop into each other. Now, these are just for fun. These are some fun failure videos that I'll let you guys watch. They're embedded in the video. When I was working with the guys at Cast Connects, they do cast steel elements and bring them in for structural strength properties, or they'll do them for architectural components. They had to test things, but one of the cool things is we often don't test large objects. So we actually got to see testing of large scale objects here. And so you're going to see that there's local bending on plates, buckling, local buckling, all kinds of cool stuff. When you watch this, you're going to see that it cycles through a diagram here, and that's a hysteresis. What they're doing is they're pretending this is an earthquake, so they're gonna stretch it and compress it. This is supposed to be a brace in a lateral load resisting system in the building, or the thing that makes the building stop tipping over. So if these are two columns and our building wants to tip over, we've got one element going diagonal like this. They're analyzing it like this. But imagine that this is being squashed and then stretched and then squashed and then stretched and squashed and then stretched. And they're measuring how much force they put on it versus how much it moves. So this is how much force they put on it, and this is how much it moves. And when you do that, so that's called a stress strain diagram. And if you do it repetitively, it's called a hysteresis. And so this is a seismic hysteresis analysis of a steel column. So there's all kinds of cool stuff in this. So the thing I want you to ask yourself, or what we're going to be doing for everything going forward, is it strong enough? And for strength, that means the different force types, or force types are moment, shear, axial, and torsion. And remember, axial can be compression or tension. Is it stiff enough? And is it stable? So is it strong enough? Is it stiff enough? And is it stable? And we do that for the building as a whole and every system, the element and every element in the building, and the connection or every connection in the building. So strong enough, stiff enough, stable, the building, the elements, and the connections. So we do that again and again and again and again and again and again. You can see why analysis software starts to be the reason we can build these really cool buildings we see getting built today. Okay, that's the end of lecture 1. Next week, we're going to start in the first few weeks, we're going to keep it a little bit light. We're going to talk, before we can even talk about these things, we need to know what structural drawings look like. So next week, we're going to jump into looking at structural drawings. Pretty sure that's what next week's lecture is. So check the syllabus, you'll see what next week's lecture is. So the things I want you to take away from today. So I like sometimes to break these tips down into what you should just know because you want to be an architect, and what you should know to pass my course. Sometimes they're the same things, sometimes they're different. So you should really, as an architect, understand where the architect fits into the structural design process. You should understand the different types of strength failures. You should be able to recognize a stiffness issue, and you should be able to recognize a stability issue. Like I said, it's not always obvious, but you should have a feel for what's going on. For the course, you need to know those math elements that I talked about. They're not that complicated. They're going back to a lot of things you probably learned in junior high and maybe a little bit in high school. You're going to get used to it. By the end of this term, you're going to be able to fly through those things, so don't panic too much. You should understand that there are different types of strength failures. You should be able to recognize a stiffness issue, and you should be able to recognize a stability issue. You should be able to calculate limit state design equations. And you're saying to yourself, we didn't do any calculations, but I talked about what that equation means. Remember, the reduced capacity has to be greater than the factored load, or another way to say it, the factored load has to be less than the reduced capacity. We used to do it where we had a factored load and a capacity that we didn't reduce. Either way, that load side needed to be less than the capacity side. And you should be able to calculate allowable deflection. That's our serviceability. So we looked at an example of that in the, I think even in there's a PDF of the allowable deflection, so it's not just embedded in the PowerPoint, it's also posted to Quercus. There's another example embedded in that. So you have 2 examples, well 3 because we did the cantilever as well. So you're going to do a few calculations of that. It's going to be available on Thursday. If you're watching this on Thursday, great. Take your time, go through it, talk to your friends. Remember, different people are going to get slightly different lengths. So you're not going to have all the exact same answers. So you can't just say, what was your answer for question 5? Because they might be different, but the process will be the same. So talk to each other, help each other out, talk to your TAs, use that tutorial time if you want. And then next week, we're going to jump into lecture 2. All right, it was great meeting you all.